Stephen Hurahan here at BrandMasterAcademy.com, and in this video you're going to learn how to use a tagline as a strategic tool using science. Stick around. Now, 99% of brands have a name and a tagline before any brand building comes into play. And that's because the founders usually come up with the name for the brand, and then they assign a handful of words that sound catchy or clever to who the founder is, and voila, you have a tagline and a brand name. But both the tagline and the brand name are very, very strategic elements in the overall communication strategy. And if you understand how they're used as strategic elements, then you can put them in place within your brand so that your brand is aligned from the very, very first touch point. Now, when we think of a brand, the first thing that comes into our mind is the logo. And there's a good reason for this. It's how our brain works. We are visual creatures, and we can actually digest images as quickly as 13 milliseconds. And that image then is stored in a part of the brain that's easy for us to recall. So that's why it's so easy for us to remember logos more than complex language. So when we think of a brand, we tend to think of the logo first, but the second thing that we think of is the next most simplistic form of communication from that brand, and that tends to be the tagline. Now, our brains digest images through the limbic system, which includes our reptilian brain. So hundreds of millions of years ago, when we were lizards, we still needed to be able to see the landscape. We needed to be able to see danger. And that's how our brains back then were able to digest that type of information. And then about 150 million years ago, when we started to develop complex language, our neocortex, which is our new frontal brain, that was able to digest complex language. Now, the images are digested through the old limbic system, and complex language is digested through the new neocortex. So the neocortex digests the tagline, but the simplicity of the tagline makes that a bridge between the old limbic system and the new neocortex. So the logo and the tagline creates a shortcut, and that then leads back to the complex elements of our brand. Now, that's a lot to digest, but essentially if we're able to make our tagline memorable and simple enough so that it creates a bridge between our easily identifiable logo back to our complex brand, that is when the tagline acts as a strategic tool, and that's how you can solidify a position in the mind of your audience. Now, I searched high and low in all different types of dictionaries, from the Oxford Dictionary to the Cambridge Dictionary and everywhere in between, for a definition of a tagline that I could give to you that would make sense. But to be honest, none of the definitions that I found really did it justice, so I'm just going to give you my definition of what a tagline is. So to me, the tagline is the memorable formation of a concise set of words which capture the unique value a brand offers its audience. Now, there are 4 key words to this definition, and they are memorable, concise, unique, and value. So memorable, if it's not memorable, it won't get stored in the memory, and therefore it can't perform its task. Concise, so the tagline has to be concise or it's not going to be remembered. So the optimal range here should be between around about 4 to 5 words. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, it's just a rule of thumb, but 4 to 5 words is a very good optimal level. Unique, if there's nothing unique about it, then why is anybody going to remember it? And of course, value. The offer of the brand can't be different for the sake of being different. The audience actually needs to associate value with that difference to motivate desire for that offer. Now, one brand element that is never ever understated is the logo. In fact, if you go and ask 100 people to tell you what a brand is, 90 at least are going to start banging on about the logo. And the fact of the matter is that the logo and the tagline are just 2 strategic elements. And in fact, they're just as important as each other, and they come together to act as a team to first get the audience to remember the brand and then get them to associate that brand with an idea. So the logo does the job in planting the visual aspect in the old limbic part of the brain, and then the tagline does the job of leading the audience through the neocortex back to the complex messaging of that brand and associating that brand with an overall idea. So it does have a very, very specific strategic job, the tagline, and that is linking the logo to the big idea of the brand. So essentially the logo and the tagline come together to do a combined job, and that job is brand recall. If they do that effectively, it leads back to an idea, and that idea is the position that the brand wants to own in the mind of its audience. Now, there are 3 steps that the audience will go through before they position the brand in that place in their mind. Step 1, they need to remember the visuals. They need to remember that logo. Step 2, they need to remember the message, that tagline, and they need to create a shortcut between the logo and the tagline. And step 3, to remember the idea. If they remember the logo, they create a shortcut back to the tagline, and that leads to the idea. That is when they can begin to store the idea in their mind. Now, there are 3 different levels of complexity to these steps, and each progressive level is more complex. So the first step, the visuals, that's stored in the reptilian brain, and that's the easiest to remember. The next step involves language, and that's a more complex step, and it's still simplistic, so it's still easy to remember. But then that leads to the third step, the most complex step, which is all of the other elements of the brand. So each step of that process is progressive, and each step needs a more higher level of understanding from the brain. So that's why it's really important to make the logo as easy to remember as possible, the tagline as easy to remember as possible, and for those two to align back to the idea of the brand so the audience can store that idea in their mind for that brand. Now, there are 2 distinct stages of the tagline. The stage 1 is the stage that I just spoke about. It's the stage of solidifying a position in the market, to be able to get your audience to understand that logo and create that bridge back to the idea. If you do that effectively, then you can solidify the position that you have identified within your positioning strategy that you want to own in the mind of your audience for your brand. Now, that is the first stage of the tagline, and it really needs to be considered when developing that tagline, how strategic it is in order to solidify that position in the mind of your audience. If you just develop a logo and develop a tagline without really considering the position that you want to own in the mind of your audience, then you've really missed out on an opportunity, and a strategic opportunity, to solidify that position. But that is the first stage of the tagline. Now, once a brand has solidified its position in the mind of its audience, then it'll begin to develop a high level of brand awareness. Once it's done that, once it enters into the long-term memory of the audience, then it can shift the job of the tagline. If your audience has a high level of awareness about your brand, and you don't need to create that shortcut anymore between the logo and the big idea, then the tagline can become an extension of the idea so that it reinforces and crystallizes that idea. So it moves from stage 1, where it's solidifying the position, into stage 2, where it's crystallizing an idea. Now, this is reserved for brands with a high level of awareness, and you tend to see brands such as your big conglomerates, your Nikes and your McDonald's and your Apple, to have a tagline that doesn't focus on their differentiator. It doesn't focus on bridging a gap between the logo and the idea. It focuses more on crystallizing that idea. So the example with Nike is just do it. Nike isn't focusing here on bridging a gap between the logo and the idea. Nike is crystallizing their idea in the mind of their audience. And Apple, with their Think Different tagline, is doing the exact same. McDonald's, again, with I'm Loving It. These brands are not focusing on the differentiator that they bring to their audience. They're not focusing on their positioning strategy. They're focusing on the big idea, and they're crystallizing that big idea. So the tagline has 2 stages. Stage 1 is solidifying that position, and brand builders shouldn't shift their focus here. They shouldn't think too far into the future of when their brand is going to be a massive conglomerate and they want to crystallize that idea. They should first focus on solidifying the position in the mind of their audience. And if they do come to a level where they've got huge brand awareness, then they can shift into phase 2, which is to crystallize that idea. So there are 2 phases and 2 stages within the lifetime of a tagline. Now, I'm not going to wrap this video up by telling you that you know what a tagline is. You've known what a tagline is for a long time. I'm loving it. Just do it. Think different. These are all taglines that are stored in your long-term memory, and you probably have about 20 more. But those taglines that are stored in your long-term memory probably represent a big idea, and they've probably moved from phase 1 to phase 2 so that that brand can crystallize that idea in your mind and really own that position. But what you do know now is the strategic aspect of the tagline, why it's so critical in solidifying a position in the mind of your audience in that phase 1. You understand how the brain digests information, and now you know going forward that when you come to developing a tagline, that you really need to create a bridge between that visual aspect of your brand and the big idea. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button. If you've got any questions, pop them in the box below and I will be happy to answer them, and I will see you in the next video.